We are back for episode 4 of Parkour History with Max Henry. On the last episode, we were talking about Raymond Bell. Make sure you can listen to some of these episodes out of order and it'd probably be all right, but it's best to listen to them in order because they definitely build on each other. And that was an amazing story, one of my favorite nodes. But we're moving on and kind of adjacent to Raymond Bell, you could say, to another thread that, forms the cable that it becomes parkour. And this one is sort of the entertainment industry, how it's developed, stunts, and actually, how would you describe it, Max?
I think you nailed it. It was really interesting to me, both talking with Sebastian and hearing some of the founders talk a little bit more about their thoughts when parkour was kind of being formalized in the 80s and 90s. It was really fascinating that entertainment and anime ended up becoming an actual contributing factor to their practice. And we wanted to explore that a little bit here. And I think you really can trace it back to the 1920s. And it's adjacent both to Georges Hebert's story, and it's also adjacent to Raymond Bell's. And it kind of starts around the same time in the early 1920s, post-World War I, that Georges Hebert, if you remember, decided to leave the French military. He was disillusioned by all of the savagery that he'd witnessed in World War I and wanted to focus on building a culture around his method in France. And that's also when he started the La Palestra. And you see kind of a similar cultural movement happening in the U.S. It wasn't as severe because obviously World War I didn't take place on American soil. But around that same time, you get the development of Hollywood and the Western film industry. And it starts out relatively slow. These are the days of the silent picture, and people didn't really know what to make of the medium at first. And old film is really, really cool. It's so experimental, and it's really fascinating now to look at an industry where it's just churning out billions and billions of dollars and seeing it as this tiny thing like parkour where you had all these personalities who were, putting their love of the craft and figuring out what stories to tell. One of the most popular stories or attractions in early cinema ended up being slapstick comedy and also kind of early stunts, you could call it. And these were actors like Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin who had a physical presence to their storytelling. One of the most famous scenes probably is the Harold Lloyd scene where he's hanging off of a clock on top of a skyscraper and, has to climb, and you get that gut-wrenching free solo kind of experience as the viewer. And you can only imagine what it must have been like then. I'm sure you've heard this story, but one of the first moving pictures that was ever shown to an audience was a train coming basically toward the viewer on screen, and people got out of their chairs and ran out of the way because their brains didn't understand how to process it as a visual medium, right? So it was really, really interesting to me that one of the first attractions in Western cinema was this focus not only on dance, but also on things that now we'd recognize as stunts. And I wanted to start there because it ties into a couple things. The first thing to me that I find really fascinating, this is the 1920s again, as this medium of film is developing, there's also a huge change in the way that cities are being built, particularly in the United States. So New York and LA, they've run out of space, New York in particular, and everybody starts building vertically. You get the materials, the engineering know-how, and the funding and motivation to start building skyscrapers. And there's an amazing, amazing piece I highly encourage anyone listening to check out called Gizmo. It's from 1977, and it's about wacky inventions, but they have a few minutes toward the beginning. They've got a segment on how people interacted with skyscrapers when they were first being built. And you've seen, I'm sure, the photos of, the steelworkers who are on the I-beams in Empire State Building eating their lunch and balancing 50 to 100 stories up in the air. And what was cool to me is they weren't unique in that. There was this fascination in general with skyscrapers suddenly appearing, and then all of a sudden people appeared to challenge this new vertical realm. It was very much in the spirit of mountaineering, which had become really popular in like the 1880s and 1890s and started to capture the imagination. And you got a really interesting mix of people who basically were doing gashua on these skyscrapers.
Gashua for the uneducated. This is a deep cut, as Callum likes to put it. Gashua is a sort of satirical term that was come up with by Dylan and I, or Dylan a long time ago, Dylan Baker. It's getting on high things, standing, hanging, and walking around, or something. That it's an acronym for that.
Going on high stuff, standing, hanging, and walking around, or something. But basically, you had that, like the viral videos of Mustang Wanted and James Kingston. You had that happening in the 1920s. So we're talking 100 years ago, or a little bit less in some cases. People were circus performers, were doing handstands on the edges of buildings. People were unicycling on the edges of buildings. It was the exact same.
Just like down to get the airboard or whatever.
Yep,
but
it was the exact same thing.
Not much has changed. Yeah.
Not much has changed. And when I saw these clips on Gizmo, that film that you can find on YouTube as well, it was really funny and also really mind-blowing, because it was almost like this ancient aliens civilization moment of like, whoa, we've been here before. Why? how did we not get further along? And that is something that I know we want to explore a little bit in this episode. But just to kind of continue with that context, we have skyscrapers coming up. The city is changing dramatically. Urbanization is huge. People are moving at a much, much faster rate into the cities. And you're also, with the boom of the entertainment industry, seeing things like Circus performing live or on film. These are becoming viable ways to survive and ways to live. So people who are athletically talented and have a head for heights, or, you know, have a mind that's geared toward entertainment, suddenly they have an outlet for that, where they don't have to work on Ma and Pa's farm back in Iowa. They're able to move to New York or to Los Angeles and start to tap into those skills. And you see these talent hotbeds developing. And that is kind of the churning mass that the Buster Keatons and the Harold Lloyds and the Charlie Chaplins were coming out of in the art imitating life sense. And I'm not sure if it was, I believe it was the case that the actual acts of people scaling these skyscrapers, because people were free soloing a lot of these buildings as well, especially in New York. I don't know if those inspired the film version or vice versa. They happened pretty concurrently. I'd guess probably that people were doing it first, and then you had it in films.
Yeah, often what I notice in film is like it happens in real life. Like, you know, you take parkour as a perfect example. Parkour is the thing. Casino Royale makes it bigger than ever before, and then eventually reality catches up, and something like what you saw in Casino Royale or other crazy films happens, or in a video game. You know, these things start to actually occur.
Totally.
So then, yeah, you know, it's a chicken and egg kind of thing, but ultimately I think it's rooted in reality where these people were actually doing these things. And Alain Robert is another kind of node that kind of held this candle, not, you know, in the middle of these generations. Now we are seeing him even pass it further down. There's like Leo Urban and Alexis, and some of these guys there's some more skyscraper. It's starting, I don't know if it's making a resurgence just for a few people doing it, but, you know, with the Gashua, the Mustang Wanted, we are seeing lots of engagement with these tall buildings again.
And that's kind of where this story of parkour starts for me, and why I even thought it was worth including this in parkour, because something we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode, the kind of difference between stunts and parkour, whether or not these entertainers were doing proto parkour, right? They were starting to look at the environment around them in a creative way, and they were finding challenges in an environment that wasn't made to challenge them. And that is parkour.
Yeah.
So the people in the 1920s that were looking at these buildings and seeing opportunity there to climb, in this case, that is kind of the foundational mental building block for creating parkour. And in the early 1940s, I think we see this taken a step further with a young man named John Ciampa from Brooklyn. And I'm so grateful. I actually got to, so John Ciampa, you may have seen videos of, I think it's called 1920s parkour, or, old parkour in New York.
There's like the famous shots of this dude, jumping off a train into water, swinging on a tree, like really high up, doing like climbing a tree really fast, throwing himself or descending down.
Yeah, he's like stemming in between a wall with a little kid on his back. Yeah,
doing a wall run up an old wall. It's all black and white. There's like him balancing on kind of a spiky fence. There's some of the more iconic clips that come from that video.
Yeah, and
it's not all, it's like 90% or 80% him, right? And there's maybe
so the only clip I believe that's not him that's in the YouTube video that's out, that's gone viral a few times, is the one jumping into water. That was a stuntman from a film. The rest is John Ciampa, and that actually is all from this piece that Paramount Pictures did on him in 1942 to promote film Tarzan in New York. So John Ciampa is a really, really cool character in the kind of history and development of parkour. And I was lucky enough to get to talk with his grandson, who grew up 2 towns from me on Long Island. Unbeknownst to myself, I was going on Facebook and I found this great Facebook page with some amazing archived footage that John Ciampa's son and grandson have put together. And I highly encourage you to check it out as well. It's, I think it's Brooklyn Tarzan is the name of the Facebook page. It's wild because I had seen this, old school parkour or parkour in the 1920s black and white video, and it is cool, but it's kind of like when you watch Jackie Chan. It's things that you could imagine any athletic person who, for whatever reason, needed to move through the environment, they would do some of those basic moves, right? Like dropping kind of in a lache from a vertical tree branch to another tree branch, doing a little wall pop that was like 9 feet. I'm like, all right, cool. That's not, you don't really need parkour technique to do that if you're athletic. And then I went into these archived videos and oh my goodness, it is insane. I nerded out so hard. There are shots of him doing plyos on these like small, probably 2x4 wooden I-beams behind, like wooden scaffolding. And he goes up them super, super quick, probably 2.5 or 3 stories. And then he's doing like 7 or 8 foot plyos on the tops of these wooden I-beams and like ends in precision, drops back down and descends down the other side. There's another shot of him in the same tree and he's doing 360 underbars to regrab. He's doing like 8 or 9 foot laches in between tree branches. It's legitimately technical parkour movement. Like he does one lache precision in a tree from tree branch to tree branch. And that to me is like, cool. You are doing parkour movements at this point. Yeah.
100%.
So I'm like going through these videos and you can't watch those videos and say, oh, that guy just kind of was athletic and developed these skills. Like he obviously had to train this skill set. And I found out from his grandson that John Ciampa grew up in Brooklyn. He was obsessed with Tarzan films growing up. Douglas Fairbanks, like the original Tarzan, I believe. And he really loved those films. So he grew up kind of watching the 1920s stunt films and decided, yeah, that's totally what I want to do. And in this, we see an echo of the Yamakasi again later. And he went out.
Every practitioner, it's like origin story, which is... Yeah, I saw a parkour. I mean, it's literally a meme in our culture. Where it's just like, yeah, it's typical. I saw the parkour video. I wanted to do it. And he saw Tarzan and he said, I'm going to do that in real life. And he went out and as a kid, he'd just play in these trees in Brooklyn. And I guess they had trees in Brooklyn back then, which is its own cool fact. But his friends gradually stopped and he just kept doing it. And by the time that he was like 19 or 20, he was discovered by Paramount Pictures, who wanted to do this feature on him to help promote their Tarzan in New York adventure film. And that is where all of that black and white footage stems from. And you can watch the whole video. Most of it's covered in that viral clip, but there are a few other really cool clips that aren't.
and it is on YouTube and in a couple other places online, and we can find that and link it in the description as well. But he developed this way of moving and interacting with the environment that at first I didn't want to believe was reminiscent of parkour, and it really, really was. It's wild. And as he does this, he gets to the point where, like many of us in parkour, he needs to move out, make a little bit of money, start his life, and he goes into circus. So he tries stunts. He's somewhat successful in stunts, but at this time, it's like the late 1940s, the stunt industry is moving on a little bit from the slapstick comedy and kind of gut-wrenching physical stunt work of the Buster Keatons and the Harold Lloyds, and they're moving more toward like spaghetti westerns, horseback riding, crazy gun tricks, driving cars around, that different type of stunts that audiences hadn't seen before, and that audiences at the time were starting to engage with a little bit more effectively in the eyes of Hollywood. So Ciampa's skill set, while it was built off of this original Hollywood in the 1920s, didn't really apply to stunts as well when he was trying to make it in the 40s and the 50s. And you also have to keep in mind 1950s America, very different place than 1920s, the roaring 20s in America. So culturally, there's also a difference there. And Ciampa ends up in the circus. And I really, really like this part of his story because in the circus, he's hanging out with circus people. They're hand balancers, they have jugglers, they have all these specific skills. Some of them are ex-gymnasts or gymnasts, acrobats, and he is something else. He's just this unique anomaly of movement. And listening to or reading some of the descriptions in newspapers of Ciampa in these acts, it is really, really crazy again, because you get this wild kind of flash forward to the Yamakasi where reviewers and people who are watching don't know what to do. They have these expectations for what they're going to see in a circus performance. And then there's just this wild Tarzan guy jumping around and taking big drops and swinging on stuff. And like, what is going on? And I think as a parkour practitioner, that hits really, really hard for us. And that to me was this amazing extra little tidbit that added some depth to Ciampa as a legitimate kind of contender to be in this story of parkour's development. I will say also that it was very cool talking with his grandson online. Both Ciampa's son and grandson are aware of parkour, and they get such a kick out of like watching parkour videos. So the grandson in particular, he'd like said he'd watched parkour videos before. He thought it was really cool that people in parkour respected and were kind of reviving some of the things that his granddad had done. And they were just really stoked to see his grandfather's legacy being kind of picked up by our community, because after he'd gotten out of the circus, he'd kind of tried to make money and he'd done a good job, but it was one of those things where he was constantly living a little bit hand to fist, it seems like. And he was also really passionate as a fisherman. So he did spear fishing. He would go do like free diving. He ended up inventing and patenting a spear fishing gun that could be used underwater. So he was this really diverse human with a lot of interests physically, but nothing ever really took off in the same way that it did for a lot of the other stuntmen in the 20s, for instance. So he never had his Hollywood multi-million-dollar deal moment. And it's easy to see a Georges Hébert-esque situation with his legacy as well, where the world wasn't ready for what he had at the time. And it's only now in some ways that we're starting to look at what he brought to the table and realize how ahead of the time he may have been in a movement context. And that's really, really cool. Yeah, no, it's powerful. Do you know where, obviously you picked up this thread of John Ciampa, and I know I'm aware of him. We all, even if we don't know, his name, we've sort of, many of our generation have seen that video and sort of been inspired by it. Is there other direct connections that you've discovered between him and founding practitioners or other people that have picked it up, or is it just kind of like been out there waiting for anyone to uncover it? Yeah, so I think he's kind of like his development, if we're looking at the growth of parkour as this evolutionary tree, it's almost like this vestigial branch.
Yeah.
That, he started doing this thing, and as far as I know, I could be totally wrong, and we could get a message from, Jan or one of the Yamakaze after this episode saying, "Oh no, we're aware of John Ciampa," but I haven't heard that from any of them. And what I will say though is we know that while the influence of early Western cinema wasn't as foundational for the founding group of parkour practitioners, what was really foundational is kind of what comes after that in the stunt industry. So John Ciampa, the way that his career kind of ended in stunts and in the circus and entertainment, it was pretty representative of what was happening in Western cinema at the time. Again, there's that move away from a lot of these more environmental stunts, I guess you could say, people interacting with their environment just with their bodies. And there is a move toward these things like the cars and the spaghetti westerns and guns. And there's a lull.
Yeah,
but for several decades.
You could say maybe he obviously helped champion and pioneer some of the very earliest stunt work in the physical realm and in things that you can see related into parkour. And then we might have lost that thread a little bit, but it gets picked up where he left it off essentially when, which we'll get into in the next episode. Yeah. With, the next set of films that kind of revive it again in the entertainment industry. Yeah,
I think that's the cool thing about the way that this story goes, right? Yeah. Is you have this lull in the West and people don't kind of realize what they're missing out on. And then all of a sudden, after a few decades, things start to get stale again and Hollywood producers are looking for the next big hit. And all of a sudden they realize, these Kung Fu films coming out of Hong Kong, they seem to be playing pretty well with Western audiences. And that is when you get what eventually brings us to Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, who were direct influences on the founders, both in terms of their philosophy, their approach to movement and training, and obviously some of the movements themselves. And that's going to be something that we'll touch on next episode. But before we kick into that, I think it's really important to also address the question that you had, which is kind of where does John Ciampa, who's sort of the pinnacle, I would say, of that branch stemming from the urbex of the 1920s, why did that branch die out? Yeah. Because that's something that I had this like fantasy while I was just chatting with his grandson. I almost could think of an alternate universe where this kid from Brooklyn watched some movies, did amazing physical feats that people didn't know were possible, went and did it live. People were fascinated and confused, and then started a worldwide movement, not called parkour, but functionally parkour in the 1940s and 50s. And it, to me, was a struggle to think like why, what factors led John, who was doing many of these same movement patterns, what stopped him from starting parkour in 1942, and what gave the Yamakaze the founders, the ability to start parkour in the mid and late 1980s?
Yeah, that's a very cool, interesting question, and I would love to speculate on it with you. Certainly I don't know for sure, but one thing that jumps to mind is I would want to talk to Alain Robert for sure and see what he knows about John Ciampa. Because I think, or like any of these people that maybe also contributed to, I don't know if the Yamakaze actually know about Alain either. But I imagine that Alain, I'm just curious about his story because he seems to be actually a pivotal figure in this thread. And maybe this vestigial branch is a little bit more robust than we're giving it credit for right now. And I'm just curious, but it's very interesting. Maybe there is a parallel universe where that is the case. And we can, one day investigate it through. I think jumping, but
I think it takes us to the reason I even bring it up is because I feel like this question is really important one for us now, right? That's the whole point of this podcast is like, what are we as practitioners in 2022 getting out of these stories about the development of our practice. And the first thing I think that comes to mind with this one, even before we talk about why that died out potentially, is, you know, what is the difference between stunts and parkour? And for me personally, and this might not be an opinion everybody shares, I think the pivotal thing, and this is part of what maybe stopped John Ciampa from becoming a pioneer of this movement as well, stunts and the entertainment industry, movement is packaged as a product. And it's kind of the same thing that we talked about in the Georges Hébert episode, where the circus folk, when movement was kind of dying out all over the world, a lot of the knowledge was preserved in those like Middle Eastern and Southern and Eastern European circus communities, but people didn't see it as something to try. They saw it as entertainment. It was something to consume. And I think that there's this fundamental difference between stunts and parkour there, where stunts are a thing to be performed for the sake of others. It's a thing for other people to consume. Parkour, or any sport or discipline, is something to be done for your own sake. You know, it's an internally oriented practice in that sense, that you're doing it to get something out of it for yourself or for a close group of friends.
Yeah, that's an interesting, very interesting, you know, insight. I think that, yeah, we've talked about how there's also the dichotomy between the utility side of things versus like the aesthetic side of things. And I think you're making the case, and I think I would agree with you, that if you had to put parkour on one side of the fence, it is a utility also born sport, or at least it was born out of like and I don't know what that really means, utility, because maybe it overlaps more with what you're saying, which is like it's an internal inward journey. It's like it's something that is intrinsically valuable and not necessarily valuable because people are willing to pay for it, or, you know, it's not just for the performance. There's something else there. Yeah.
If people stop watching parkour videos, I'm not going to start riding horses and making spaghetti westerns. Right. And that's, I think, the difference that you're pointing out as well with that, the utility sense, right? It's helpful for us, and it's helpful for other people, not just because they can consume it, but because they can be inspired by it to make changes in their own life. And this is really important still for a lot of parkour people who maybe want to get into the stunt industry. I mean, we've talked to a lot of people who've gone into stunts.
Yeah, it's very
and realized.
Excuse me.
We've talked to a lot of people who've gone into stunts and realized what I loved about movement isn't present in this community in the same way.
Yeah, that's interesting to notice. Yeah, we see it all the time. I mean, even some of our very best, it's so close. The line is paper thin, it feels like sometimes, between these two things, stunts and parkour, because, you know, you look at someone like Pasha is a great example, who, you know, we know emulates and has, you know, at least made references to Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and some of these like figures we just mentioned, and he's very obviously embedded in the entertainment side of things now. But the more embedded he is in that, the less relevant he feels to me in the world, in the space of parkour. I mean, he's always going to be Pasha, so it's not like he really is ever less relevant, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, and just like we see people get drawn into the stunt industry, and it just doesn't feel like it's the same thing.
Yeah,
you know,
Pasha's a great example of that.
And I think magicians are an interesting category that kind of like mirror that side of things. Like, I think Houdini has done some crazy shit, you know, that like almost borderlines on parkour sometimes. Not that, you know, I don't know that much about him, but I think magicians also fall into this stunt category when sometimes they're doing things, and there's sometimes, you know, like you know, the secrets behind their tricks are just hard training or hard like practice of doing things, which is so fascinating because it is sort of a discipline in that right. But it puts
the value less on the skill and on what you do with it.
Yeah.
And that's the entertainment aspect. And I think that coming back to, you know, why didn't parkour develop in the late 1940s? Well, historically, the big obvious answer is World War II. 1942, not a good year if you want to, you know, start some.
Hey guys, you want to go outside and just jump around?
So part of it is, right, there's just this historic inevitability. Like, you're not gonna. We saw it with Georges Hébert. World War I sidelined méthode naturelle for 7 years essentially. And we kind of get a similar thing here with John Ciampa, where you have a lot of this momentum and it's suddenly being killed by World War II, and people don't want to be confronted with these like life or death entertainment anymore. You know, they want something that's maybe feels a little bit less realistic and a little bit more out there. So they suddenly go to the American West or these, you know, older, more fantastic stories. But I also think it comes down to the fact that what separated the founders of parkour, and this is such a pivotal thing, from Georges Hébert or from John Ciampa, is they were able to synthesize the philosophy side of it, of the practice. And the philosophy is what creates that foundation for other people to approach the thing you're doing. That's what keeps it from feeling like magic. You know, you're not Houdini. You're revealing your trick to the audience, and you're saying, come on, like, I want you to join in and I want you to push this thing with me, by creating a community that's built around this idea, these shared concepts and shared values. And they're able to synthesize that with movement that was fascinating and intriguing and wanted it. The movement itself was cool enough to encourage people to try it. Because Georges Hébert, as amazing as Méthode Naturelle was on the philosophical side and the values side, it was exercise at the end of the day. And people enjoyed it, but it was a much smaller niche. It didn't have the wow factor. John Ciampa had the wow factor, but it was packaged as something that he did. He was unique. He was special. He was the magician. And there was no way anybody else could approach it. And if you're a kid who wants to emulate John Ciampa, where's the motivation to even try at that point? And that's where I think parkour ends up taking off. And that was what was so unique about the kind of culmination of all of these factors.
Totally, yeah. You wonder if John Ciampa, I think if his friends had maybe stuck with it with him, that would have been like the key ingredient, because that changes everything when there's a community around it.
And we'll definitely see that in the value of having a group to, even if that group isn't training together, like we'll see with the founders of parkour, right? Even if the exchange of ideas isn't happening every day in person, having a group of people who are pushing in different directions, you're expanding. Not just, you know, you're not just like, if you're starting out as a dot on a graph, when you have this group that's expanding in all these directions, you're growing in every direction as a circle. You're not just a little triangle pointing off, you know, on one axis and getting so far in that direction that nobody else can relate. And that's really part of the value of a group. And in our next episode, really excited to talk about where these values of community and some of these values for developing a training approach and a methodology, making parkour a discipline and not just a form of entertainment or something like a spectacle in the purest sense of the word. That idea for discipline is digested by the founders, many of them through not only Georges Hébert and his practice in the French military, but also through this medium of Eastern martial arts film and anime. And we're going to see that next episode when we talk a little bit about Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan and Goku. Who else?
All right. And we'll see you on that episode. Make sure you check out everything in the description if you want to support this series and find links that we might provide.
Yeah, learn more about John Ciampa. Huge thank you as well to his grandson and his son for allowing me to pick their brains about his life. I really appreciated them sharing some information about John Ciampa and his life and his story, because what he did was amazing. And if you haven't gone to the Brooklyn Tarzan Facebook page to watch some of those old videos, it's really wild, and you'll be happy that you did.
All right. Paying tribute. Let us know what you think, and we will see you on the next episode. Thanks.